Thank you, Craig. Thanks for having us here. I'm going to do a rapid pace PowerPoint of the latest developments in the Washington political global warming narrative, if you will, and what's happening. First of all, earlier we announced the new Climate Hustle documentary. We hope to have it out this fall. And we are actually doing a bunch of interviews here, and I've already interviewed Michael Oppenheimer of the United Nations. And it's just funny, one note, given Russell's talk about the financing, I actually have a quote of UN lead scientist Michael Oppenheimer on a Tom Brokaw Discovery Channel documentary saying that skeptics were literally motivated financially to be skeptics. Now, that sounds interesting until you realize that Michael Oppenheimer was a paid scientist of the Environmental Defense Fund for years before he went to Princeton. And here's the kicker. When he was at Environmental Defense Fund, he got $250,000 from Barbra Streisand as an endowment. He was literally the climatologist to the Hollywood stars. And that's how absurd the funding issue becomes. You have people who took money from big Hollywood and worked for Big Green, telling mainstream media figures like Tom Brokaw that it's the skeptics who have financial biases. And one other fact is he endorsed John Kerry for president in 2004, worked for a group called Environment 2004, and then later won a $100,000 award from the foundation run by Teresa Heinz Kerry, John Kerry's wife. So that's just like one scientist who happens to be one of the most prominent United Nations IPCC scientists and his funding issue. But I just wanted to mention that because Russell's talk got me thinking about that funding issue, and that'll be in the documentary. I actually confronted Michael Oppenheimer about the Barbra Streisand money, and of course, he did his best to dodge and deflect it. My talk today is, can the UN, Congress, and President control the weather? Now, I'll show the quote later, but we have John Podesta, White House Obama advisor, who literally told the Weather Channel last week that we need the EPA CO2 regulations because the weather is getting wackier and more extreme every day, and these regulations will help bring the weather in line. A little bit about my bio. This is the only bio panel I have up here. Climate professor and a live BBC television called me an a-hole on air broadcast, and I was very disappointed because 2 days later he sent me an email apologizing for it. But as you can imagine, this was a pretty big deal. This was like a week after ClimateGate scandal broke, and Andrew Watson was one of the ClimateGate figures. It was a fascinating moment, but this is how they treat skeptics. The good news first. We're facing a huge problem right now in Washington, especially from a communication point of view. I hate to say it, but I think the global warmers have learned from decades of failure and may actually, to bring up the Vietnam War, we allegedly won every battle from the platoon level up, but lost the war because we ended up pulling out at the end. Well, we may have won every battle of the global warming war, from preventing UN treaties from being ratified, i.e. Kyoto, preventing cap and trade in 2005, 2007, 2008, 2009, stopping the vote in 2010, preventing carbon taxes. Yet, with the EPA regulations, they may actually achieve all that they've been trying to achieve. And don't say, oh, well, the next president can stop it. Well, if it's Chris Christie, his EPA has already praised Obama's climate regulations. If it's Jeb Bush, he's very iffy on this issue, or has been iffy. But the good news is, we'll start with that, majority of Americans worry very little. This is a poll from about 2 months ago, March, April, from Gallup. Climate change, near the bottom of the list of 15 issues. I think only race relations is lower. So as much as we want to say, oh, the mainstream media does X, Y, Z, the bottom line is the mainstream media is a dinosaur. It's losing media viewers every year, every week. And our message of the skepticism has gotten through. And here's the problem, and there's race relation at the very bottom. Gallup went even further and said this is one of the lowest they've seen climate change in all the history of Gallup polling. And the other thing that's happening, and this has helped, this has been huge in Europe. People like James Lovelock have converted live BBC television, a BBC Newsnight. They asked him about global warming. He completely reversed himself, recanted his earlier views. He had originally said that there'd only be a few breeding pairs of couple left after billions of us died. James Lovelock, a green guru, considered one of the most prominent scientists of the 20th century. He then reversed himself and said it's become a religion. Gore was too alarmist. We don't know the physics worked out yet. He now trashes the United Nations IPCC. This was a major defection. Go back to that. This is Judith Curry. Judith Curry has said, and this was a fascinating interview just about 2 months ago. She said, as of 2009, they asked her a question, where were your beliefs on global warming, for lack of a better word, in 2009, and where are they now? Why have you shifted? Her answer, I would have rated myself a 7 in 2009 on the believer scale, and now she's on a 3, closer to 0, which is the extreme skeptic scale. And she actually says ClimateGate made her re-examine her support of the IPCC and look at it more skeptically. She's now against the concept of consensus-based science. Let's go back here 1 second. Why have we been able to, well, first of all, why have these scientists converted, number one? And I think by listening to some of the speeches here and by looking at the data, the answer is obvious. Every kid graduating high school has never experienced global warming in their lifetime. On a range of issues from A to Z, whether it's global sea ice right now, the Antarctic at record sea ice, the Arctic, which is still, which is probably their biggest poster child that they can use, whether we're talking polar bears, sea level, their predictions have failed. We saw Pat Michaels earlier talk about the climate models. But I'd say it's also because when you have Al Gore as the face of your movement, the most partisan political figure, whether you love him or hate him, it doesn't matter, you can't have a divisive political figure as the guy that's leading this. And then if you have the United Nations, in the words of old Senator John Kerry, it's the gold standard of science. Well, if it's fool's gold. And and the problem is it's a scandal-ridden, agenda-driven organization. It's particularly distrusted by the Americans. Those two things set the seeds of your doom. And then add to that Al Gore winning an Oscar and all the feeding that Hollywood did just doesn't help overall with convincing the average Americans of your case. Just a couple quotes here that, I know people know this conference at the United Nations is it has so many issues, but these are some key quotes here. Rajendra Pachauri, the head of the UN IPCC, if the governments decide we should do things differently, we can make up a vastly different set of products in which we would be at their beck and call. Bob Carter earlier today noted that the IPCC's charter is to set up just to look at how mankind influences climate. In other words, they're starting out their entire climate change perspective with massive blinders on. And they're admitting openly and publicly as they're releasing their reports that they're at the beck and call of whatever governments want. It gets worse. In 2010, much like Babe Ruth predicting where he was going to hit the baseball, they predicted how bad the science would be 4 years in advance, 5 years in advance. They said that they predicted the report would be dramatically worse. Richard Toll, who I just got a chance to interview, he was a lead author of the IPCC, refused to have his name put on, just essentially, I guess you'd say, resigned or refused to have his name, however he wants to term it. He now says openly that global warming has become a religion. It's not an existential threat. He's now going after the concept that there's a 97% consensus. This is another major defection that just happened within the last 6 to 8 weeks. Climate science, one of my favorite quotes, and I deal with the general public. I do radio, television, and I got to keep everything to the low information voter, if you will. This is one of the best overarching quotes about the entire global warming movement. It's governed by hundreds of factors. The idea we can manage it by understanding, manipulating the margins, one politically selected factor is as misguided as it gets. And this brings up EU conferences where Western leaders get together and they actually have verbal, non-binding agreements to not allow the Earth to go higher than 2 degrees Celsius temperature. World leaders at a summit agreeing to limit the Earth's temperature as though it's a giant dial they can turn up and down. It's truly become the madness of our day. Now, you say, okay, well, the science. This is probably the single most important quote you're going to see today. I actually got a chance when I was in the US Senate of going to Greenland with Connie Hedegaard. She was then the Danish climate commissioner or something. Now she's the EU climate commissioner. She hosted our delegation when we got to, by the way, a high carbon footprint trip. We went on planes, helicopters, boats, all over the Greenland, and it was so cold that the U.S. senators that went on this to show how bad global warming was had to huddle inside the boats as we went out out to look at the glaciers. She said in September 16, 2013, let's say the science is, quote, we were wrong on the science, it's not about climate. Would it not in any case have been good to do many of the things we have been in order to combat climate change? In other words, it doesn't matter whether global warming is real, catastrophic, happening, because these are the policies we need to do anyway. And hey, if we can use it to sell people and convince them that these are the best policies, that's what matters. That is a stunning admission by one of the world's climate leaders, that the science doesn't matter, we need to do these policies anyway. Central planning, central energy planning. This is where we get into the wackiness. The ice caps expand or melt, whatever happens, it confirms their theory. There's no way to falsify it. We just had Marc Morano, a federal government scientist, say that Antarctic sea ice, which has hit the record all time ever recorded since satellite monitoring began, was simply a result of global warming. We have the White House science advisor blaming record cold winters on global warming. We have Al Gore, who a few years ago said that the blizzards and record cold, I think Joe DeLeo had said the East Coast is having the snowiest decade, just surpassed the 1960s this past winter. Al Gore says it's completely consistent now with global warming. The New York Times op-ed went further. Bundle up, it's global warming. So what's happening here? This is something we really need to understand here, because I remember George Monbiot in the UK. They can credibly point to peer-reviewed studies and say, look, we predicted it. And the media will look at it. Skeptics will say, oh, wow, they really did predict it. That paper is from 10 years ago. This is why we've now at least just collecting just a small sampling of contradictory peer-reviewed papers, predicting more drought, more snow, less snow, more malaria, less malaria, more fog, less fog, winters warmer, winters colder. No matter what climate outcome, no matter the weather event, they can then point to a peer-reviewed study and say, hey, we predicted it. And that's what we're finding. So this is now why we're talking about astrology. If you go on the boardwalk and someone says, I predict X, Y, Z, and start predicting all these radical outcomes for your life. Well, as you go through your life, at some point you'll say, hey, that boardwalk astrologist, they really nailed it. They called it. They said many bad things would happen, and I've had setbacks in life, so they were right. And that's what they've done with the weather. So this is now post-apocalyptic. This is an amazing quote. This appeared in Salon magazine last year. Peace professor Michael Clare. If the earth continues heating, our post-apocalyptic fantasies could become reality. And I'm quoting him directly. I'm going to read this in a way I think that he probably intended. Quote, we envision rising temperatures, prolonged droughts, freakish storms, hellish wildfires, rising sea levels, food riots, mass starvation, state collapse, mass migrations, conflicts of every sort up to and including full-scale war, provide even more disruptive, deadly, persistent drought and hunger will force millions of people to abandon their traditional lands and flee to the squalor of shantytowns. That, in a nutshell, is how wacky the global warming debate goes. And I'm going to show you a video now. Are they stealing this from Hollywood? Please play the video here. That is where we're literally becoming as alarmist and as absurd as you can get. And I'm going to show you a clip here that I think they stole this from 20 years ago, 30 years ago now.
You could accept the fact that this city is headed for a disaster of biblical proportion.
What do you mean, biblical?
What he means is Old Testament, Mr. Mayor. Real wrath of God type stuff.
Exactly.
Fire and brimstone coming down from the skies. Rivers and seas boiling.
40 years of darkness, earthquakes, volcanoes.
The dead rising from the grave. Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
Now, we laugh at that. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. Now, I'm going to show you, I did a whole report on this. You can go to Climate Depot, enter the word Ghostbusters. We actually went through and point by point showed you one of the points, dead rising from the grave. The Siberian corpses are oozing a contagion that's coming back out, that's going to kill mankind. The corpses live. Al Gore, every night is like a walk through the book of Revelation because of the alleged extreme weather. We go on, repent and sin no more. The Washington Post last fall featured Susan Brooks Thistlethwaite urging us to, quote, repent for our sin of causing typhoons due to the moral evil of climate change, the suffering and sin of climate denial. They're literally invoking biblical images. It gets worse. White America is condemned to hell. I don't make this up. New York Times, Paul Krugman, those who deny warming may be punished in the afterlife for doing so. He called denial an almost inconceivable sin. Bill McKibben lamented white America has failed. We've fallen short by voting for climate deniers. That is where we are. I'm out of time right now on this talk, but they're also blaming prostitution, and they're also saying that a carbon tax, this was in the New York Times, this is my headline today, I'll end on this point. Can a carbon tax save your daughter from being a hooker? Congressional Democrats have introduced a resolution saying that global warming is causing prostitution. And they're also, Barbara Boxer has a carbon tax. That's Frankenstein about to pull the lever in the castle. This is the headline of Climate Depot, the New York Times, yesterday's paper. Every time you flip on a light switch, you are altering the Earth's climate for thousands of years. This is Justin Gillis. This is the level of absurdity we've come to. The EPA regulations are said to control future storms. They won't even impact global CO2 levels, let alone global temperature, let alone storms, even if you believe all of their science. So with that, I'll end my talk, and we're happy to have Q&A coming up.